Welcome to week 4 of the My God Why course, and what we're covering today is Out of the Darkness. What I want to focus on this week is actually some of the ways we process pain and suffering, the ways that we sit with the tension of what happens. We're not so much looking at the events of pain and suffering and evil, but the questions, the longings, the frustrations that come out of it, and kind of the behaviors that we may notice as we sit with these tough questions. So we're going to look at the book of Job today, and we're also going to look at what are called the Psalms of Lament. And specifically, we're going to look at Psalm 77. But before we do, I actually want to point you towards another story of someone in our faith community that has struggled with the question, my God, why? This is Laurie's story, and you may know him as one of our leaders here in the course. And here's what he has to say.
Hi, my name is Laurie Dean. I became a Christian at the age of 21. I actually became a Christian out in India. I was a traveler out there, and I ended up working with a group, an Indian Christian group that worked with people in poverty in New Delhi, and I was supported by the Bible and Medical Missionary Fellowship out there. So doing that work really confronted me with some fairly horrific things. We were working with a group of people who come in from the countryside and will squat on a vacant lot in the city and just set up a little hut there and then try to make a living. Lots of the people we worked with were garbage pickers. They just went out in the community and went through the garbage and would find metal and glass and anything they could recycle and sell, make maybe $1 a day doing that sort of thing. And we did employment work, we did public health work, we did nutrition, education, as many programs as we could with those folks. Working with them on a daily basis, I became quite close with many of them. They became like friends for me. And in that, I saw some really baffling things. I saw their children die from vitamin C deficiency, and this is taking place in a capital city of the world, in a suburb where there's actually $1 million homes all around us. And the land that they were squatting on was a vacant lot belonging to one of India's most prestigious hospitals. And medical care is free in India, so they could have gone to the hospital any time. But India has a caste system, and they felt discriminated against, and they never liked to go to the hospital because they felt mistreated by the medical staff there. So I guess as a young person, I was coming face to face with some very horrific things. There were young children that I knew quite well and had known for a year or two, and suddenly in the night they would pass away from very treatable illnesses. And as a Christian, I had to really wonder at this. I understood free will. I understood human injustice. I understood that these people were badly treated and badly neglected by the society that they lived in, and that gave me a strong sense that as Christians we should work for social justice and we should try to ameliorate suffering in the world. But some of the things that happened to these people went far beyond just human events. They were kind of like random events. And it really caused me to question, why has God made this kind of world? If God is such a loving God, surely he's troubled by this. Surely he grieves more than we do over these events. How can such suffering and how can such human evil be so extreme? These kind of events can happen. So I had theory. I got to know one of the women in the program, and we became close and eventually got married. I met Susan in India. She had this amazing outgoing personality, amazing sense of humor. She had a personality that made everybody instantly comfortable. She was just so socially skilled and fun and entertaining that she automatically made people comfortable. And I could sort of sit back and let her warm up the room because she did it so well, and I'm more of a laid-back person. And our first daughter was born in India, and we were out there for a total of 7 years. And then we moved to Canada, and I faced a time of unemployment here for a little while, but eventually things went well, and I found work at the university, and it was very meaningful, and my wife found work with the government of Manitoba and was quite successful, and it felt like we were living this blessed life, but I felt undeserving of the good things that were happening, because I'm aware that not everybody's life runs smoothly. And anyway, things went well for us for a couple of decades. We were hiking with 2 other couples in Peru. Spectacular hike at very high elevations, 4,000 and 5,000 meters. One of our friends is a physician. He was along with us. He would do health checks with us regularly. Susan, my wife, was always in the lead and always led up the ravine and was the first one to the summit, and it was kind of a joke among us that she always had to be first. So she was absolutely physically fit, but she started to develop a pain in her back, and she kept mentioning it, and she would take Advil, and that would kind of dull it, and away she went, like the first one down the path or the first one up the ravine. But this pain just continued. We were out there for 3.5 weeks, I believe. Got back to Winnipeg, and the pain became more intense to the point where we went to the urgent care and had it checked. The doctor there did a ultrasound, and he sort of dismissed what was taking place. She then went to Vancouver for a conference and came back. Meanwhile, the test results went to our family doctor. One evening, the phone rang. We were both together in the kitchen, and it was our family doctor. And the sort of rule of thumb is that they only call you if the news is not good. So Susan was on the phone, and I heard her side of the conversation, and she said, oh, so it's not good. And I was concerned, and she hung up, and she told me that the test results had shown cancer-like lesions on her liver. And I was shattered. Our whole amazing, blessed existence suddenly was called into question. I really didn't know how to react. I didn't know what to say. I was dismayed. I knew how serious that can be because I had been with my father in 2003 as he passed away from pancreatic cancer. And Susan turned to me right in that moment and said, "Don't be upset. We're Christians." And I thought, she's the one who's facing this fearful prospect, and she's turning to me in peace and confidence and comforting me and telling me not to be upset. So I felt like I can't lose it. If she's facing this with such peace and confidence and certainty, then I have to have the same reaction. And I was praying a lot. But it seemed like at every stage when there was uncertainty, when we got an answer, the answer was always the worst possible news. So it turned out that it was pancreatic cancer. Then they had to decide at what stage it was at. They found that it was at stage 4, which meant that they can't get rid of it. And we were there in the hospital every night, and I wanted to pray for healing. And I felt God's presence very close to me. There's times you feel God's presence, and there's times you don't much. I felt God very present, and I think Susan did too. And I felt a peace. I felt that we all know that we all pass away at some time, and that this can happen earlier, it can happen later, and there's a better world on the other side. But I never felt a leading to pray for healing. I somehow knew right from that point that this was going to be terminal. It was very quick. It was another 6 weeks. Her condition just deteriorated and deteriorated and deteriorated. And Susan passed away, and we had all the arrangements to make. I have to say, at her funeral, there was a huge crowd. There was probably more than 400 people. The premier of the province attended. She was that kind of a person, highly successful, very, very capable, but fun person. I then had a year which I would describe as PTSD. I couldn't really feel things well. I was kind of numb. And I started attending the meeting place immediately because I found the teaching very direct, and I found the music very uplifting. And I remember saying to the youth pastor, when from the stage the musicians say, God is so good, and give your life to Christ, and God will bless you. I know those things to be true. I've lived those things for 25, 30 years. And yet right now, I can't feel them. I don't really have an understanding of why this has happened. I don't see it as for my best. I would trade anything I've learned in the 5 years since Susan passed away to have her back. But I do know God is with me. I do know God is blessing me. I do know that God has a future for me. And I know that bad things happen. And sometimes God prevents them. Sometimes He intervenes and saves us. And sometimes He permits them. And I know there will be a new creation. And I know that we'll be present with God one day. But for the moment, bad stuff happens.
So, we're tackling the book of Job, and I actually have a video series that's going to lay out this 42 chapters of this really significant book. I would say one of the purposes of this book is actually to wrestle with the problem of evil. So, without further ado, here is our lengthy section that covers the entire book of Job.
Book of Job. It's a profound and very unique book in the Bible for lots of reasons. The story is set in a very obscure land that's far away from Israel, Uz. The main character, Job, he's not even an Israelite, and the author, who's anonymous, doesn't even set the story in any clear period of ancient history. This all seems intentional, though. It's like the author doesn't want us to be distracted by historical questions, but rather to focus simply on the story of Job and on the questions raised by his experience of suffering. The book of Job has a very clear literary design. It opens and closes with a short narrative prologue and then an epilogue, And then the central body of the book is dense Hebrew poetry, representing conversations between Job and 4 dialogue partners called the Friends. These conversations are then concluded by a series of poetic speeches given by God to Job. Let's dive in and we'll just see how it works together. The prologue introduces us to Job, and we're told that he's a blameless, upright man who honors God. He's a super good guy. And then all of a sudden, we're transported into the heavenly realms, and God is holding court with his staff team. It's a very common image in the Old Testament describing how God runs the world. And among the heavenly beings is a figure called the Satan, which in Hebrew means the accuser or the prosecutor. And it's like we're watching a court scene. God presents Job as a truly righteous man, and then the accuser challenges God's policy of rewarding righteous people like Job. He says, the only reason Job obeys you is because you bless him with prosperity. Let Job suffer. Then we'll see how righteous he actually is. And then God agrees to let the accuser inflict suffering on Job. Now, it's at this point in the story that most of us go, what? Why did God do that? And then we assume that this book is going to answer that question, why God allows good people to suffer. But as you read on, the book doesn't answer that question. Nothing in the book ever answers that question. The prologue is setting up the real questions this book is trying to get at. Questions about God's justice and whether God operates the universe according to the strict principle of justice. And the response to those questions comes as you read through to the end of the book, not at the beginning. The ultimate reason for Job's suffering is simply never revealed. So the prologue concludes with a suffering and bewildered Job who's rebuked by his wife, and he's approached by 3 friends who are going to try and provide wisdom and counsel. Their names are Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, and Zophar, the Naamathite. They're all non-Israelites like Job. And they represent the best of ancient Near Eastern thinking about God and suffering and the human condition, and this moves us into the main part of the book. First, Job speaks. And this is how this section of the book works. First, Job is going to speak, and then they'll follow a response from a friend. Then Job will respond to that friend. Then another friend will respond to Job's response, and so on back and forth for 3 cycles. And this whole debate is focused on 3 questions. Is God truly just in character? And does God run the universe on the strict principle of justice? And if so, then how is Job's suffering to be explained? As we're going to see, Job and the friends, they're working from a huge assumption about what God's justice ought to look like in the world. Namely, that every single thing that happens in the universe should operate according to the strict principle of justice. So if you're a wise, good person and you honor God, good things will happen to you. God will reward you. But if you're evil and stupid and do sinful things, bad things will happen to you. God will punish you. Now, Job's constant argument throughout his speeches is this. First of all, that he's innocent, and so the implication of that is that his suffering is not a divine punishment. Now, we know from the prologue, both of these things are true. Remember, God himself said, Job is righteous and blameless. And so Job concludes his argument by accusing God. God either doesn't run the world according to justice, or even worse, God himself is simply unjust. The friends, on the other hand, they beg to differ. Their argument is that God is just, the implication being that God always runs the world according to justice in this way, and so they conclude by accusing not God, but Job. Job must have done something really, really bad for God to punish him like this. They even start making up possible sins that Job must have committed. Job protests to all of this. In fact, he gets so fed up with the friends that he eventually just gives up on them. He takes up his case directly with God. Now, something to be aware of is that Job, he's on an emotional roller coaster in these poems. He used to think that God is just, but now he can't reconcile that with his suffering. And so in some outbursts, Job, he'll accuse God of being a bully. Once he even declares that God has orchestrated all the injustice in the world. But the moment he utters that thought, he's terrified of it because he wants to hope and believe that God is truly just. Job is all over the place in this section. And so he makes one last statement of his innocence, and then he demands that God show up personally to explain himself. Now, it's at this point that a surprise friend shows up, Elihu the Buzite. Now, he's not an Israelite, but he does have a Hebrew name. And Elihu, he has the same assumption as Job and the friends. He argues that God is just, and that implies that God always operates the universe according to justice. But then Elihu draws a more sophisticated conclusion about why good people suffer. It may not be punishment for sin in the past. God might inflict suffering as a warning to help people avoid sin in the future. Or God might use pain and suffering to build character or to teach people valuable lessons. Elihu doesn't claim to know why Job is suffering, but one thing he is certain of: Job is wrong to accuse God of being unjust. Job doesn't even respond to Elihu, and the dialogues come to a close. It's like the wisdom of the ancients has been spent, and the mystery remains. And then, all of a sudden, God shows up in a whirlwind, and he responds to Job personally. He first responds to Job's accusation that he's unjust and incompetent at running the universe. So God takes Job on a virtual tour of the universe, and he starts asking him all these questions about the order and origins of the cosmos. Was Job ever around when God architected the earth or organized the constellations? Has Job ever commanded the sunrise or controlled the weather? God has his eyes on all of these cosmic details that Job has never even conceived of. Then God starts going into detail describing the grazing habits of mountain goats and how deer give birth, or the feeding patterns of lions and wild donkeys. What's the point of all this? Remember the assumption of Job and his friends about what it looks like for God to run the world according to justice. Underneath that assumption is a deeper one, that Job and his friends have a wide enough perspective on life to make such a claim about how God ought to run the world. And God's response with this virtual tour, it deconstructs all of these assumptions. It first of all shows that the universe is a vast, complex place, and that God has his eyes on all of it, every detail. Job, on the other hand, has only the small horizon of his life experience to draw from. His view of the world is very limited. And so what looks like divine injustice, from Job's point of view, needs to be seen in an infinitely larger context. Job is simply not in a position to make such a huge accusation about God. After the virtual tour, God asks Job if he would like to micromanage the world for a day, according to the strict principle of justice that Job and his friends assume, punishing every evil deed of every person at every moment with precise retribution. The fact is that carrying out justice in a world like ours, it's extremely complex. It's never black and white, like Job and the friends seem to think. Which leads to God's last point. He starts describing these two fantastic creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan, which some people think are poetic depictions of a hippo and a crocodile, but more likely they refer to well-known creatures from ancient Near Eastern mythology that are used elsewhere in the Bible as symbols of the disorder and danger that exist in God's good world. These creatures, they're not evil. God's actually quite proud of them, but they're not safe either. The point is that God's world is amazing and very good, but it's not perfect or always safe. God's world has order and beauty, but it's also wild and sometimes dangerous, just like these two fantastic creatures. And so we come back to the big question of Job's suffering. Why is there suffering in God's world? Whether it's from earthquakes or wild animals or from other humans, God doesn't explain why. What he says is that we live in an extremely complex, amazing world that at this stage, at least, is not designed to prevent suffering. And that's God's response. Job challenged God's justice. God responds that Job doesn't have sufficient knowledge about our universe to make such a claim. Job demanded a full explanation from God, and what God asked Job for is trust in his wisdom and character. And so, Job responds with humility and repentance. He apologizes for accusing God, and he acknowledges that he's overstepped his bounds. Then all of a sudden, the book concludes with a short epilogue. First, God says that the friends were wrong, that their ideas about God's justice were just too simple, not true to the complexity of the world or God's wisdom. And then God says that Job has spoken rightly about him. Now, this is surprising because it can't apply to everything Job said. I mean, we know Job drew hasty and wrong conclusions, but God still approves of Job's wrestling, how Job came honestly before God with all of his emotion and pain and simply wanted to talk to God himself. And God says that's the right way to process through all of this, through the struggle of prayer. The book concludes with Job having his health, his family, his wealth all restored, not as a reward for good behavior, but simply as a generous gift from God, and that's the end of the book. So the book of Job, it doesn't unlock the puzzle of why bad things happen to good people. Rather, it does invite us to trust God's wisdom when we do encounter suffering, rather than try and figure out the reasons for it. When we search for reasons, we tend to either simplify God like the friends, or like Job, accuse God, but based on limited evidence. And so the book is inviting us to honestly bring our pain and our grief to God, and to trust that God actually cares and that he knows what he's doing. And that's what the book of Job is all about.
So what do we take away from the book of Job as it relates to the problem of evil, pain, and suffering? I think the first thing we take away for sure is that there are no easy answers. It's Job's comforters that have everything figured out. They know exactly why this tragedy befell him. But in actuality, they are theologizing out of their fears. As Job himself says in chapter 6, verse 21, he says, "You have seen my calamity and you are afraid." So what we discover through Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu is that people can have a remarkable capacity to ignore reality for the sake of preserving a formulaic theology and easy answers. Job's friends have a simplistic view of the universe, A to B correspondence, and it causes them to blame and accuse. Job's friends need to blame him because they can't accept that the universe is in any way arbitrary, as it seems. In the process of reassuring themselves, they are indicting Job. They have become the accuser. So my friends, my encouragement to you is, as you wrestle with the problem of my God, why, resist simple and easy answers. Resist the temptation to explain everything and thereby assign blame like Job's friends did to him. Embrace complexity, embrace mystery. The second thing I want to point out here of a valuable lesson we can take away from the book of Job is that trusting God is not about having all the answers. Peace comes to Job when he learns that though his suffering is a mystery, he can and must nevertheless humbly trust God. Job doesn't learn the reasons why his tragedy has befallen him, although we, the audience, actually know in chapters 1 and 2. Job doesn't have an easy explanation for why things happen the way they do. In his response with his encounter with God, we see that Job chooses to simply and bravely trust. And I think that's the purest definition of faith, that we trust in God's character, that we know that God is not causing evil things to happen to us, but bringing good out of evil. The last thing I want to take away from the book of Job is that true lament is honesty before the Lord. See, one of the things you'll notice if you read the book of Job is that he doesn't really mince his words. As the book progresses, we see Job tells it like it is. He's brutally honest about his feelings. There are times when Job even gets angry. He makes some damning claims against God. For example, Job claims that God is stalking him like a lion. He wonders if God is unjust. He thinks God ignores the prayers of the wounded. And Job even accuses God of destroying people's hopes. Now, what's amazing to me is that God says in the epilogue of the book of Job that Job spoke rightly. And it's not that God is actually giving a blanket approval of everything Job has said. Rather, what we see is that God is saying that Job spoke rightly in the way he was honest, even when it wasn't pretty. So I think this teaches us that true lament is a call to be honest with our struggles and pain. God honors honesty. We see this all the time in Scripture. And in fact, one of the places we see this the most is in the Psalms. But I think sometimes it's really easy for us as people of faith to think that we need to almost use our faith as an insulation from being honest about pain and suffering. It's easy for us to kind of just say, God is good, and brush off our feelings, brush off our struggles. And when we do this, we become dishonest with ourselves. And that can lead to really tough places. My friend Carolyn Clausen is going to share a bit about why we actually need to be honest and why we actually need to enter into our grief and lament. Here's what she has to say.
As a therapist, I listen to people talk about their feelings professionally. Often people have avoided doing it on their own. They're frightened about it. They don't know how. And as we have a chance to do it, they are often surprised by the value of feeling some of the really hard and dark emotions in the therapy office. It might sound funny to say, and kind of obvious, but we feel our feelings. And feelings are important because they give us information. If you put your hand on a hot stove and it hurts, you pull it off really fast because that feeling of pain helps you know that you should take your hand off that stove so you won't get injured further. And physical feelings like hunger or thirst help us take care of ourselves. And other feelings like loneliness or sadness or anger are feelings that we can feel, and then we know when we learn what is good for us, when we listen, pay attention to those and respond to them. It's vulnerable to let others know about how we're doing and what we're feeling, but God created us in God's image for connection. And so often those feelings are a cue to us to reach out for support and care. Feelings cannot be denied. When we push down our feelings and ignore them, they will insist on being heard. And so feelings that haven't been allowed to come out, they are down there and they'll start speaking. Sometimes you'll see people with road rage or yelling at a sports game or kicking the dog because those feelings need to come out. Not allowing ourselves to feel that pain is actually a stress on the body, and the truth of those emotions and that feeling of stress cannot be denied. Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score, and it's true. You'll find that unexpressed emotion comes out in high blood pressure or being ill more often or mental health disorders. The other thing about emotions, the really painful ones, is that people think if I push it down, then I won't have to feel it. And maybe they won't for a while. But when you numb the dark, you also numb the light. You cannot selectively numb fear, sadness, and frustration. When you do that, you also numb things like joy, creativity, love, playfulness. I was working with somebody not too long ago, and as we had that person start to dip his toe in some of the hard feelings from decades past, he started to kind of open up. And to his delight, he came in one time and told me that he had been praying with his child, and his child had prayed completely not aware of what his father had been doing and saying, "Thank you, God, that mommy and daddy aren't fighting so much, and thank you that daddy is playing with me more." And he hadn't noticed that his child had seen that, but he had. I absolutely think that an important part of Christian spirituality is to express the full range of emotions. God created all these emotions in us, and He called us good. Feeling the full range of feelings is a part of the call of God in our lives, to grow more and more into Christ-likeness. Not by pushing the bad stuff down, pretending it's not there, but actually bringing it up and processing and moving through it and healing it where necessary, so that we can get freedom from some of the stuff that might otherwise chain us. I think it's a part of trusting God's love for us when we feel emotions that feel like really powerful, that He won't let us drown in them, and that we can dip our toe and feel it bits at a time rather than becoming overwhelmed. Sometimes I think feeling some of the darker emotions has us feel really ugly and unlovable. And part of knowing God and trusting Him is knowing that we are lovable no matter what we are feeling. We can feel our feelings without being controlled by them. We can notice the pain and make decisions about what we're going to do about those feelings. If you can feel it, you can heal it. When God says, love your neighbor as yourself, I think that's a really powerful mandate to recognize that just as I would take care of a friend or a neighbor that's struggling and in pain, I would work to hear their story, I'd work to hold their pain, care for them, that God asks us to do the same for ourselves. 1 Fred Rogers from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, he was an ordained Presbyterian minister, and I think he was right when he said, anything that is human is mentionable, and anything that is mentionable can be more manageable. When we talk about our feelings, they become less overwhelming, less upsetting, and less scary. The people we trust with that important talk can help us know that we are not alone. I actually wrote a book a couple of weeks ago and put it up on Amazon called What is Mentionable is Manageable, because I think when you move through a pandemic, I think it's important to figure out how to feel some of those feelings to be able to move through something hard, and a global pandemic is absolutely hard. I remember telling a psychologist friend of mine a couple of years after my divorce, I am so angry, I am so enraged, I don't even know who I am because I've never known myself to be this angry, and I'm uncomfortable and I just want it to go away. And Linda said, it's okay. It won't last forever. Anger is something you can listen to, you can hear it, you can honor it, and then just be really careful about the choices you make with the people around you when you're feeling it. It will pass. And I could hardly believe her at the time, but it did. Anger is energy, and I think there was some value in moving to and through that anger after I had felt so very sad and wrung out and sort of just wasted for so long. The last thing I want to say about feeling emotions is that times of difficulty, times of darkness, they suck. Just frankly, absolutely suck. And yet when I look back at times in my life when I grew the most, when I feel like God was close and God was working something in me, well, it was during those times of struggle. Good times are absolutely fun and absolutely preferable to the hard times, but they just don't give the sort of growth as when I'm feeling crushed or discouraged. I love this quote from Dr. Barbara Brown Taylor from her book, Learning to Walk in the Dark. As many years as I've been listening to Easter sermons, I have never heard anyone talk about this part. Resurrection is always announced with Easter lilies, the sound of trumpets, bright, streaming light. But it did not happen that way. If it happened in a cave, it happened in complete silence, in absolute darkness, with the smell of damp stone and dug earth in the air. I let this sink in. New life starts in the dark. Whether it is a seed in the ground, a baby in the womb, or Jesus in the tomb, it starts in the dark. I don't wish you or anybody grief, sadness, or frustration, but I do pray for the courage and wisdom for you to be able to move through the grief, sadness, and frustration, through it, not around it, but through it, trusting that God will be the faithful companion, knowing that God can compost that darkness into fertile soil of growth in your life.
So how do we move through grief and not around it? How do we process our pain? How do we come out of the darkness? Well, one of the ways I want to leave you with today is the practice of praying the Psalms. See, the Psalms are these collections of poems and songs written by multiple authors. They're found in the pages of Scripture, in the Bible, about halfway through. And they give us the language of the human experience, especially in our relationship with God. And when we pray the Psalms, we can actually enter in to the same emotional and spiritual space that is offered to us by the psalmist. Walter Brueggemann put it like this. He said, "Psalms offer speech when life has gone beyond our frail efforts to control." This is certainly the case with the language around pain and suffering and what to do with our feelings and our emotions. You see, over a third of all the Psalms are called Psalms of Lament. These are Psalms that have the language of honesty, of confessing our disorientation and our grief. They are the Psalms that cry out, "How long, O Lord?" And it is one of those Psalms, Psalm 22, that Jesus quotes from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" If you find yourself in that kind of space of wanting to pray a psalm of lament, if that's your cry, I want to leave you today with the prayer of Psalm 77, which is a psalm of lament. May this give language to your cry, and may it be a prayer for you. So we read, I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated, and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject me forever? Will he never show his favor again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? Then I thought, to this I will appeal. The years when the Most High stretched out his hand. I will remember the deeds of the Lord. Yes, I will remember your miracles of long ago. I will consider all your works and meditate on your mighty deeds. Your ways, God, are holy. What God is as great as our God? You are the God who performs miracles. You display your power among the peoples. With your mighty arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. The water saw you, God. The water saw you and writhed. The very depths were convulsed. The cloud poured down water. The heavens resounded with thunder. Your arrows flashed back and forth. Your thunder was heard in the whirlwind. Your lightning lit up the world. The earth trembled and quaked. Your path led through the sea, your way through the mighty waters. Though your footprints were not seen, you led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron.